Hi there. Thank you for watching this video today. Welcome to our agency nutrition training about serving community members who have diabetes. So first, let's just cover who might need blood sugar friendly foods. So another way to say this might be a diabetic friendly diet or a low sugar diet. Those terms tend to be used kind of interchangeably. So we'll just understand for the purposes of this training that we are essentially talking about the type of diet that someone with diabetes or pre-diabetes might want to follow. And you might get other people at your agency who also are interested in following this type of diet, maybe someone who has a history of cardiovascular disease or stroke. And it is just kind of a healthy way to eat. So you might have some people who don't necessarily have a chronic disease, but are just interested in following that type of diet as well. So, like I said, we might have different types of people who are looking for foods like this, but for today, we're going to be focusing on diabetes. So let's cover just a few diabetes basics. So when someone has diabetes, they have trouble regulating their blood sugar. And we'll get into the details of that a little bit more later on in the training. But it's important to know that 1 in 10 US adults has diabetes, and 1 in 3 US adults has prediabetes or kind of early stage diabetes. And 80% of those people with prediabetes have no idea that they have it. So if you've never talked to your doctor about that, now might be a good time to do so. Also important to know that unmanaged diabetes can lead to very serious health complications. So cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, vision loss, nerve damage, etc. So why is this important for a community food program? Well, the main reason is that diet is a really, really important part of managing diabetes. So the foods that people are able to get through your services might be a huge part of them maintaining their health. Obviously, many people with diabetes are also working with their doctors and maybe taking insulin or another type of medication, but diet is always a really, really important factor. It also makes sense that medical care is expensive, right? We all know that, we all feel that. But for someone with diabetes, their medical costs can be up to 2 times the medical costs for someone who does not have diabetes. So just between the medication that they have to purchase and the care that they need, especially if they have complications from their diabetes, it's possible that the expensive medical care for someone who's diabetic is the thing that's pushing them kind of over the line into food insecurity, because that's a huge competing expense for food, rent, all of those things. And finally, diabetes, like any chronic disease, unfortunately can be stigmatized. So someone who is coming to a pantry, especially for the first time, knowing that they're going to have to make special requests about what foods they do and do not want to take, that can be really stressful for someone, and people may feel a little bit funny about it. So for you as the pantry coordinator or volunteer or meal site coordinator, for you to even just have that little bit of understanding about what diabetes is and kind of what they might need can really make all the difference for someone in making them feel comfortable. So let's get into a little bit of detail about blood sugar and how it's related to diabetes. So this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but this diagram really helps my brain to wrap around it. So hopefully it helps yours as well. So when we eat a food that contains carbohydrates, so in this example, we're going to say a bagel, our body breaks that down into super simple sugar molecules called glucose. So glucose is what gives our body energy when it gets into our cells. And to get the glucose out of our bloodstream and into our cells, we need a hormone called insulin. And for people with diabetes, their body either isn't producing enough insulin or their body isn't reacting normally to the insulin that is produced. So essentially, instead of getting that glucose sugar into our cells for energy, the glucose is just kind of hanging out in our bloodstream with nowhere to go. And that's what can lead to some of those health issues that we talked about earlier. So carbohydrates are still very important for people who have diabetes, but it's important that especially when they eat carbohydrates, that they do so in a way that makes sure that the blood sugar response to those carbohydrates that are being consumed is gradual, like that bottom green line on the graph, rather than a spike and a crash. So how can we do that? So some important things for regulating the blood sugar response or making sure that our, energy that we're getting from our food is gradual rather than a super quick spike and crash is basically to eat foods that are harder to digest. So what I mean by that is high fiber foods. So our body has to work a little bit harder to digest and break down a food that has high fiber than it does to break down a food that does not have high fiber. So high fiber foods include whole grains, beans, fruits and vegetables, nuts. Those are all good high fiber foods that take a little bit longer to digest, and therefore the blood sugar response is a little bit more gradual. For a similar reason, it's also a really good idea for people with diabetes to pair their carbohydrate foods with a fat or a protein or both. And for the same reason, fats and proteins take a little bit longer to break down and digest, so it blunts that blood sugar response. And lastly, limiting added sugars and refined grains, or things like white bread, for example, is another way to make sure that our blood sugar isn't spiking and crashing. So simple sugars, added sugars, refined grains, those are all things that our body can break down like that. And so we get that really immediate blood sugar spike when we eat those foods. So we'll talk quickly too about MyPlate for diabetes. So I'm sure everyone is familiar with that bottom right-hand corner image, and that is kind of the typical MyPlate diagram that we see. So MyPlate is just some general recommendations of the food groups that we should try to incorporate ideally at each meal and the proportions that we should incorporate them in. And the main difference that you can see between the typical MyPlate diagram on the right and then the MyPlate for diabetes on the left is that the general MyPlate diagram has a spot for both fruit and grains. And then when you look at the MyPlate for diabetes diagram, you can see that it just has one spot for all carbohydrate foods. So fruits, grains, and then also starchy vegetables that kind of act like carbohydrates in our body. So potatoes, certain squashes, things like that. Those would all fit into that carbohydrate food section that should take up about a quarter of our plate. And then you can see that they specifically call out non-starchy vegetables in the vegetable half of the plate. So those are the main differences between MyPlate for diabetes, or a healthy meal for someone with diabetes, and the typical MyPlate diagram. So now let's get into some foods to focus on. So luckily this is not all on you, right? Your client is going to come in and they're going to have a really good idea of what they're looking for, and they're going to be able to tell you exactly what they need. But it's still helpful for you to have a general idea of some things that you could suggest or offer to them as you're going through the pantry. So some foods to focus on, of course, right? Fruits and vegetables, and fresh, canned, and frozen are all great for someone with diabetes. If you are going to go with canned, low sodium is ideal. And then if it's a fruit that's canned, you want to look for a fruit that's canned in water or maybe its own juice, rather than a fruit that's canned in syrup, since that means added sugar. Lean proteins are also a really important part of a diabetic diet. So poultry and fish are both great options. Plant proteins like beans and nuts, tofu, all that kind of stuff is great. And just generally, any type of less processed protein tends to be good on a low sugar or a diabetic diet. And then, like we talked about, whole grains are very, very important. They've got that great fiber in addition to the carbohydrates. So some examples of whole grains are oats, brown rice, barley, quinoa. These are all whole grains. And then you can look for products that are made with those whole grains. So whole grain bread, whole grain pasta, and whole grain cereals can be good choices as well. And here we'll talk about some foods that clients might be limiting. And the reason that I say it this way is that it is never our job, luckily we're off the hook on this, to tell clients what they should or shouldn't eat or to limit a food for them. These are just things that people with diabetes might be wanting to avoid. Now, if they want to pick up some of these at your pantry, who knows, maybe they can have it in moderation and it doesn't bother their blood sugar too bad. Maybe it's for another person in their household. It doesn't really matter to us, right? We're not in the business of telling people what they can and can't take. But these are just some things to keep in mind that they might be avoiding if they are diabetic. So first one's pretty obvious, foods with added sugar. So cookies, candy, cakes, any of those things that have high sugar, high carbs, and not a lot of other nutritional value like fiber or proteins and healthy fats to back that up, those are all going to spike blood sugar very quickly. Same things with sugary beverages like sodas. And then there's certain foods that added sugars tend to hide in. So I know I've been shocked before when I've checked nutrition labels and there is a lot of added sugar in a food that is not even a sweet food. So some examples of those would be ketchup, sometimes spaghetti sauce. Different sauces tend to be a big hiding spot for added sugars. And then, like we talked about, canned fruit and syrup is also another place that added sugars can be found. Refined grains are another group of foods that diabetic clients might be limiting. So things like white pasta, white bread, refined or sugary cereals, all of those kind of things. And then highly processed foods are another type of food that tend to have high carbohydrate, high sugar, high sodium, and again, not a lot of other nutritional content to back that up. So processed and breaded meats, canned and ready to eat meals like mac and beef and things like that. And then, of course, those really simple kind of carb foods like chips, crackers, things like that. Those can all be things that people with diabetes might be trying to avoid. So when in doubt, you can always check the nutrition label. And some things to look for on that nutrition label are going to be especially fiber and added sugar. So a good rule of thumb when you're looking at a nutrition label, some of you have probably heard this before, is to check out that percent daily value column. If something is 5% or less of your daily value in a serving of that food, it's generally considered low in that nutrient. If it's 20% or higher, it's generally considered high in that nutrient. So we would love to be in the high or at least close to high category in fiber. 11% isn't too bad. And then we'd ideally like to be a lot lower than 48% in added sugar. So that's one thing you can check out if you're ever unsure about a food. And then just some more final tips. The best thing you can do is just offer support with a non-judgmental attitude. If you know that you have, a decent amount of diabetic clients that come in, and you can maybe adjust your ordering accordingly to make sure that they have foods that are going to work really well for them. That can go such a long way when they show up to the pantry and you can say, hey, I ordered this to make sure it was here for you. So that can be huge for a client. Another tip is to provide diabetic friendly recipes. You can find those online or you can reach out to our health and nutrition team. And then lastly, of course, you can always follow the client's lead. So luckily, like I said before, we get to be off the hook as far as telling people what they should and shouldn't eat. But us having this little bit of background information on diabetes and what foods can be helpful or maybe harmful can be really helpful in terms of someone feeling comfortable showing up and feeling like they have kind of an advocate who's going to help them through the process and that is looking out for them and their health too. So thank you for watching our video today. If you have any questions about this or any other health and nutrition topics, feel free to reach out to our Food Bank's health and nutrition team. Our email address is right there on the screen for you. And if you're interested in checking out any of our other nutrition resources or nutrition trainings, check out the Food Bank Partner Portal under Agency Training Materials. Thank you for all you do and have a great rest of your day.